Lorine, first off, thank you for taking the time to come on the podcast. I do want to give you your flowers before we jump into it because you're a trailblazer, a pioneer, an inspiration to a lot of people who want to get into, specifically people of color, want to get into finance and investing. So, thank you for leading the way when it comes to that. But before we jump too far into your career, I want to talk about your days at Brown because my brother went to Brown, my aunt went to
Oh,
Brown. I spent a lot of time on that campus, know the type of people and the caliber of people that come out of that university. So, what would you say is your biggest takeaway or best memory from attending Brown University?
wow. So I didn't know you had that connection to Brown. So that's awesome. And I was just on Brown's campus recently judging the $50,000 pitch competition. It's just an amazing environment. There's so many great moments I had there. But what I would say about Brown, I think one of the biggest things about Brown is teaching us to be leaders and not follow what other people are doing. And it's really interesting. I was an entrepreneur resident at the Nelson Center, which is their entrepreneur center, which didn't exist when I was at Brown. And so a lot of entrepreneurs have come out of Brown, and there wasn't a formal program. And so they created a formal program. And it's the center's been around for now, I think, about 6 or 7 years. And I sit on the President's Council for Entrepreneurship for President Pax and her council. And I think Brown is just a great school in terms of just building leaders. And so a lot of people go there, not to rule the world, but to change the world. And I think it's pretty indicative of the people that go to Brown and the type of people that they admit into the school.
Yeah, 100%. And now looking at your career, which has spanned across multiple industries, music, technology, now sports, what would you say is the biggest takeaway there? I mean, you've been able to work alongside some of the pioneers of these industries, some of the top leaders among these spaces. What would you say makes these people so great? Like, what did you learn from these experiences in these different industries?
Yeah, no, it's a really great question. I've had a varied career, started out in entertainment, particularly music. I was a DJ at Brown, a radio DJ, and then when I graduated, I worked at a couple of record labels, and then ultimately went to law school. Worked at the William Morris Agency, now which is William Morris Endeavor, which is the top agency. Now they encompass also sports with IMG acquisition, and obviously people in theater and movie stars and music, and then also went to go work at one of the first social media companies, technology company, and that was sold ultimately. And then another company I was sold to Oracle, and then law firm world. And I would say, and in each of those experiences, which were the pillars for where I'm at now, each of those experiences led me to where I'm at now. I didn't set out to be a VC, but what I would say is in those environments, you had people who were leaders, people who took risk, who knew their domain expertise really well, knew what they were doing. I think about, when I was at the William Morris Agency, we had agents who were experts in their field. They had an incredible network. When I worked for Londell Macmillan, that was when I was practicing law. We represented Prince, Shaka Khan, Stevie Wonder, Roberta Flack. Fun fact, I did the very first hip hop arena tour, which was Jay-Z, DMX. We represented DMX. It was the
Wow.
Hard Knock Life tour. So before that, a lot of hip hop artists were playing in small club venues, and this was the first time that they played at big arenas. Like, in the New Jersey, tri-state New York area, they played at the Meadowlands, where the Jets and the Giants play. So, the stadium, and so that was the very first time. And so, and when I watched the Super Bowl, just kind of full circle, see Kendrick Lamar performing, it made me think about, there was a time where people didn't want these artists to perform in those type of venues. And so we've come a long way. And so I think working for Landell, he was a trailblazer. He took risk, not like risk for his clients, but risk in terms of he left a big law firm to start his own firm, and he brought Prince as a client. And and then build, from there. Now he owns the Source magazine, and now is more focused on business. And then I just think about other people in my world, in the VC world, who have gone out and launched their firms, and that's what was the impetus for me to launch 125 Ventures, last year. Just I had worked at other, I had launched two other funds with some people, but it was time for me to do my own thing. And really, what I was really passionate about, which I know we'll get into, is sports, and
Mhm.
then the intersection of media, technology, and entertainment, which is intersectional. And I think those experience working in media and entertainment, working in technology, all of those things were this intersection. And so I think I'm in a great position to be able to see how these worlds, connect and intersectional, which they're very much intersectional right now.
Yeah, 100%. And since you brought up 125, I definitely want to get to that. But can you kind of break down for people who might not understand raising a fund entails? Not getting too much into the weeds, but can you kind of
Sure,
explain that process and what goes into like
absolutely.
starting your own venture fund?
Yeah, so how I got into investing, I'll just take a little step back.
Yeah.
I was actually an angel investor, and those are people who you invest your own money. You have to be an accredited investor, which is defined by the SEC. I'm not going to get into like the weeds of that. And so I was making my own investments, and then I decided to make more of an impact to be able to invest in a lot more companies. I needed to start a fund, and so so starting a fund. My first two ones I partnered with some people. But basically, you are basically raising a fund. It's a blind pool of capital, meaning you have what you call investors or limited partners. They invest in the fund, and the fund is run by a general partner, a general partners plural, and they make the investment decisions, the people who have raised the fund. But we go out and we get investors to the fund, and then we'll make investments. So my previous two investments, the first fund, we made 17 investments, and then the subsequent fund right after that, we made about 18 investments. And so, yeah, so we basically, our investors invest in us in the fund, and they, hope that they're investing in us as people that we're good investors. We're going to get into great deals. And then through our network, getting great deals, and then, invest in the best companies, and that will ultimately have an exit when those companies have an exit. So, so we invest in a company just for discussion purposes. When we invest, it's valued at $10 million as discussion purposes. And then, at one point they're valued at $500 million, 500 million, they've gone up 50x. And so basically we get a return based on what we invest in that company. And so, roughly it could be a 50x of what we invested. Say we put in, 250,000, could be 50x, and then 80% goes to our investors and 20% goes to the fund managers. So that's, kind of the quick and dirty of a VC fund and the way it's structured.
Why was now the right timing to start 125 Ventures? I mean, you talked about your passion for the sports industry, and obviously there's a lot of activity around the space, but why did you feel like, um, you all should build a fund around this and have a thesis specifically, I guess more specifically, looking at women's sports?
Right, great question. So I am a student of markets. I love to look at trends and things that are going on. And, I do a lot of reading. And I think to be a successful investor, you always have to be a perpetual student and looking at trends and where things are headed. And I'm also a sports fan. I didn't play in college, but I played sports growing up through high school. I focused on academics in college. So, and then there was at the time no future really for women pro sports, to get into pro sports. But one of the things is I saw what was happening, particularly in basketball. I've been a longtime WNBA fan, and then women's soccer. I started seeing when I would go to games and matches, the demographic changing. And what I mean by that is I used to go and it would be like all women. And then I started seeing fathers, not with just their daughters, but with their sons. And their sons are wearing, so I'm a big, New York Liberty fan. So Breanna Stewart jerseys, Sabrina Ionesco jerseys. And so I'm like, wait, this is a massive shift. And then also you go to the matches, Gotham FC, and then I've gone to some NWSL, some US women's soccer matches. And again, you see like fathers with their sons and just men now at these matches or these games. And for me, that's like a big shift. Because I thought about like when I was exposed to sports initially, my godfather was the first Black sports reporter in the New York Times. And he took me to my first baseball game, the New York Yankees. We were living in Harlem, the stadium was right nearby. And I remember going, and I was 7 years old, and it still stays with me. Go into the stadium, you see all kinds of people. And that's when I really, I didn't know at the time, I couldn't maybe articulate it, but I saw like all kinds of people, Black, white, Latinos, every race, age, gender, rooting for the home team. And sports is a unifier. And, so what make the link to that is when you have a little boy going to a game to watch women, running down the field or on the basketball court, that's like normal for them now. They've been exposed to it as a young kid. So you know what? When they get older, they'll probably take their kids, and it's like no big deal. And so I connected those two dots and I said, now it's gone beyond women as fans. And of course, there's a lot of women fans, but now like there's a greater market, and stats have shown that for the WNBA, which came off last year, an incredible season. They said 1 out of 25 sports fans are interested in the WNBA or watch the WNBA, which is incredible. And so, I saw like the rise of women's sports, obviously, stuff that's been written about it. Deloitte just actually put out their most recent report a couple days ago around women's sports. They had projected last year women's sports was going to break the $1 billion mark. It actually almost broke the $2 billion mark. And then there's studies that show that women's sports, the growth is going to be exceeding 300% through 2030. When you look at general sports, all of general sports, compounded annual growth is about 6%. And so there's a huge opportunity in women's sports. And as an asset class, if you're talking about like leagues and teams, it's truly undervalued. And so when you want to buy an asset, you want to buy low, sell high. And so now's the time for women's sports.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, there's definitely this massive shift, and you kind of beat me to the punch. But I want to talk about the opportunities that you all are interested in at 125, because investing in sports can take a lot of different shapes. It can be sports agencies, it can be emerging teams and leagues, it can be tech companies. So, what are you guys kind of seeing in the landscape, and really taking a keen interest in when it comes to investing in the asset class?
That's a really great question. And yes, the sports industry is a big industry. I think most people think of like leagues and teams. That's only one part of it. We'll probably make one or two investments in a league or team emerging. These are these niche emerging leagues that are developing. But really the focus is on this whole intersection of, sports media entertainment at the intersection of tech. And so what we're focusing on is AI data analytics. Think about, you have teams are using AI, they're using data to think about, well, you see it like calling plays or just like data, also for recovery of their athletes. And, I'll give you an example of a company I invested in, Aura, the sleep tracking device, which now has expanded beyond just sleep, but really, truly a health tracking device. I made that investment about 4.5 years ago, a personal investment out of like me as an angel, not through a fund. And really, it's a data analytics play. You have all this data, it's tracking data through this ring, and it's really to help people, optimize their health. And actually, a lot of people know it as a B2C, like consumer device, but in fact, they have a robust business, a B2B business. So they have contracts with the Department of Defense, the US Navy. So all the pilots who fly the naval planes, they get the ring. Real Madrid, the Knicks, UFC, NASCAR. And so these leagues and other organizations, are giving this ring to key people who need to be optimized in terms of their performance. So that's one area. And so we'll continue seeing proliferation of, tech companies, that are going to use data analytics to improve sports outcomes or outcomes recovery and all of that. The other area is college athletics, name, image, likeness. So for people not familiar with that, there was a recent case, the NCAA, there was someone who brought a lawsuit which now allows student athletes now to participate in profits that universities make. And then also they're allowed to use their name, image, likeness. They can have brand sponsorship. They were not allowed to do that in the past. And with this new ruling, it was an antitrust case that was brought, and now they're able to do that. And so it's really interesting. You have companies that are sprouting up to help the universities because they have to now pay these students. And so there's a lot of, I tell people whenever there's change in terms of regulatory changes or legal changes, there's opportunity. And so you're seeing companies like, for instance, I invested in Scout, my previous fund, really interesting company. Michael Haddix is the founder. He worked at Goldman Sachs. But it's basically RIA. It invests on behalf of, targeting student athletes who now have come into money, making investments for them, and then but also teaching them financial literacy. So he has partnerships with a number of like Division I schools, which are required to teach them financial literacy because these students are now getting some money and you don't want them to go and blow it and just be, good stewards of the money that they're getting. And so he's created a company focused on that. There's another company called Cura Story, which is a two-way marketplace for the creator economy, connecting student athletes and then health and wellness influencers to brands. And so she's built this platform, and she was a former data analyst at ESPN. So those are a couple examples. And then, I mentioned creator economy, communities, fandom. There's companies around that. You have, whether it's an athlete or a well-known person, or even people who are not necessarily well-known but become creators because they put out content. So there's technology around that and interesting things going around. And then the last area is live and immersive events, where you have this really, I think particularly after COVID, people want the third space. They want to get out of the home, get out of work, but a third space where they can come together. There's a loneliness epidemic in this country, and probably even globally, and people want to be around other people. And so there's stuff like Cosm, which is like a supersized like sports bar meets like Sphere, where you can go and immersively watch a game and have food and connect with people. I was just at the TGL, Tomorrow Golf League, the new golf league. That's Tiger Woods and Rory McIlroy.
Yep.
I was there and using technology, but indoors. 17-hole course, but using technology. And it's like I'm not a big golf fan. What I would say is high energy. Like the players are mic'd up, they break for commercials. There's like loud music, like lights, camera, action, flashy. And so they're trying to appeal to another demographic. So you're going to see more of this, like, live and immersive, just like, this whole total experience that people, want around sports. But it's going to be, again, the intersection of technology and entertainment and media.
Yeah, it's a lot to unpack there, but as you're talking about these companies, one of the things that I'm listening to and hearing is great products and experiences, but also great founders. So when you're
Absolutely.
looking at companies to invest in, is there like a specific vetting criteria or kind of checklist that you all go through when you're looking at a deal or an opportunity?
Absolutely. Yeah. So I think you reference, I think one of the biggest things is the founder. So it's a saying in VC, bet on the jockey, not the horse. And what I mean by that is you want to invest in a company that is led by an incredible founder. And so what I define as an incredible founder, someone who has great domain expertise, who understands what's going on in the market, who is incredibly resilient, and who will, it's a tough environment, like raising money and being an entrepreneur. You're going to get far more no's than you're going to get yeses, and they're just going to be crazy. Like they're not going to give up. They believe that this is an incredible thing that they've created and a great idea, and they're going to be able to execute. So that's really important. The other thing we look at is just, is this a big market? At the end of the day, I have investors investing in my fund and they want outsized returns. So we have to find companies that are going to really, you come in, the valuation is lower, and they're hitting milestones, and then it'll be worth a lot. That there's going to be someone who can acquire them. Most likely it'll be an acquisition. Very few companies go to IPO. So just really big market. Those are really important. And I say also, is this a painkiller and not a vitamin?
Mm.
So it's a solution. It's a product that people really need. And so if you think about it, if you have a migraine, you're gonna you want like a Excedrin or whatever painkiller, right? Now, you can take vitamins. We should all take vitamins, but it's not everyone does it. But if you have a throbbing headache, you're gonna like try to get that painkiller, and so you want to have that kind of sense of urgency, or the product to have that kind of a pain point it's addressing, that people are going to pay for it. And so yeah, so I mean, we have a whole due diligence checklist, but those are
Yeah.
some of the highlights.
That's really good insight. I love that the painkiller analogy. I think that's perfect for any founder that is looking to launch a product to really understand what the market needs instead of what
Hmm.
they believe that people want. But I want to go back to women's sports for a second because as you talked about the growth, I'm curious to hear your thoughts on like what do you think contributed the most to this shift and this growth in women's sports over the past, let's say, like 5 years or so? What is it? The media attention? Like, what exactly is it that kind of has
Yeah,
catapulted this
that
industry?
I think it's certainly, I think it's the media attention. I do think it's also just the demographic shifts in people who are fans of this. As I mentioned, when you have dads taking their sons and dads going and not, like I said, I used to go to WNBA games, like, a lot of WNBA games, and it was predominantly women. And I think that's a part of it. I do think the media now, I think now there's a lot more opportunity to watch women's sports, which is good. And you have, you know, different leagues and, signing media rights deals where you can watch women's sports, which is really great. So that's giving women's sports more exposure. I also think, and particularly like women's soccer, I think the women have been incredible. They've won 4 World Cups as a team, whereas the men's soccer in the United States is not up to par. No offense, but it
It's
just
true.
isn't.
Yeah.
But there was a whole thing about, they weren't getting paid equally, and they had a lawsuit, and that was finally, dealt with after they won the World Cup in 2019, and they were still getting unequal pay. I think it just heightened, I think it heightened, well, were women winning, particularly in soccer, and just bringing in new fans, and then the media rights. And I would be remiss to say if I didn't highlight Caitlin Clark and what happened with, when she was playing for Iowa, and then, her first season, and then also, not just her. I mean, she's certainly ignited. I mean, I'm not taking anything away from her. I do think it brought a different set of fans, I think. But we've had women play, but also I think, look at Angel Reese is also like household name, social media. If you
Yeah.
think about when Lisa Leslie, who's a big, was a big WNBA player, she was actually, I think, one of the first players, basketball players to break the $1 million barrier, not from her pay in the league, but through like, her endorsements and modeling and all that. So now you have these players who have direct relationships, social media with their fans, and they have like several million people following them. Now people want to see them go through the tunnel on their way to the game, and they're wearing like different fashion. And, so all of these things, coming together have elevated women and the market for women's sports, which is great.
Women's sports valuations are incredibly high right now. I mean, there's a long list of investors who want to invest in WNBA teams and WSL teams, and it's definitely driving the demand. Do you think these valuations are justified when you look at the overall landscape?
Well, I actually disagree with you that they're very high if you compare them to men. So,
That's
this
fair.
Boston Celtics, right? Recently, I think it was like valuation was like six billion or something. And then
Yeah.
if you look at the NFL teams, Denver, which was sold, I guess, a year and a half ago or so. The Dallas Cowboys is like the most valuable NFL franchise. You're talking like $6 billion, like around that. What I would say is it's actually, pun intended, first inning, early innings for women's sports. And so, yes, what I would say is the valuations have increased drastically. So, for instance, Angel City, to get their franchise license and launch that 5 years ago, I believe it was like $2 or $3 million. And so, this whole new Denver NWSL is something like $110 million just to get the franchise license. And so you see the big difference within 5 years. There's nowhere near where some of the men valuation, if you look at MLS, Major League Soccer for men, the valuations are a lot higher. But we're on a growth trajectory. So I don't think, excuse me, it's too high. I think, they're getting higher, which is great.
Yeah, that's what I should have said. Some people might say they're too high, but when you look at some of the ownership groups in these cap tables, obviously a lot of them it is a white male dominated industry. Can you talk about the importance of having diversity in diversity of thought and people of color on these cap tables and any ownership groups when it comes to sports?
Yeah, I mean, sports it's a microcosm of society, of the world. It's no different. I mean, it's a different industry, but what I would say is, if you think about, I mean, any kind of organization, company, you know, I would want diversity, and it's not even just like race or gender, but diversity of people's experience, lived experiences, all these things. And, endless studies have shown that by having diverse organizations, those organizations outperform non-diverse, homogeneous organizations. And I know right now we're going through this whole anti-DEI thing right now. But at the end of the day, I mean, look at the roster of, if you look at teams and sports, it's incredibly diverse.
Yeah.
And so, wouldn't you want all those people to have like a voice about that, like what's going on? And with women's sports, I think it's important to have women, be owners, women participating on high levels of the sport, because at the end of the day, really the most people who are watching it are women, but that is changing and evolving. And so it's important to have those different voices to be a part of those organizations and shaping it.
Yeah, 100%. Couple more questions before we wind down here. Uh, what advice would you give to someone who's looking to invest in sports as an asset class?
Like any investor, you should learn about what you're investing in. I think people think, oh, sports, it's great and this shiny object, and it's cool. There's some cool factor to it. But at the end of the day, it's a business. It depends on what do you want to invest in. Like we said earlier, the sports industry is a vast industry. So you've got the teams, the leagues, you've got tech companies, you've got the venues, and so there's different components of it. And so think about what area are you most interested in, learn about that, or if you have domain expertise that you can bring, and so you can do it through, now there's so many ways you can invest now. You can invest through a fund, or you can invest, try to have direct investment. Part of that is going to be your network, but there's platforms like AngelList and different platforms. But what I would say is the advantage of investing in a fund is that these are people who have subject matter expertise. They have a great network. They're able to get into good deals. But just explore it. I would say also go to industry events, learn what's going on in the industry, build your own network. And that's, I mean, I started investing literally 11 years ago, and I built a network. I wanted to start investing when I heard less than 2% of VC went to women, less than 1% went to Black founders, and I wanted to change that. But I did that by learning and going to industry events and learning about this.
Lastly, what's kind of one broad prediction or even the thing that you're most excited about when you look at the overall landscape of women's sports and what's to come ahead?
I think we're gonna have tremendous growth. I think we're really in early innings, and I think as women's sports matures, I think there's going to be new emerging niche leagues like Love, the volleyball league, which raised over $100 million. You've got now the Women's Professional Hockey League. It's just, and the women's soccer is going to grow. The U.S. is hosting the 2026 World Cup, so people are gonna have soccer fever, and the women are incredible that we have, the national team as well as the NWSL, and so I think there's going to just be continued growth in this area, and I think particularly now that not just women are watching it, and also media rights are going to increase.
Yeah.
And so I think that's going to bode well for the leagues and also getting money to players. And so I just think it's going to be an upward trajectory. And if you look at how like other leagues grew, like the NBA, it wasn't an overnight success in other leagues, it grew over time. The NFL, same thing. I think women's sports is going to have that similar trajectory.
Lorraine, this has been great. Lastly, where can people connect with you, learn more about the fund, and get in touch?
Sure, yeah. So I'm on LinkedIn, my first name, last name, Lorine Pendleton. Also, I'm on Instagram, so at Lorine VC, and the fund's website is 125ventures.vc. You can find out more information there. But Malcolm, I want to thank you for this. I love what you're doing with Vetted Sports and your newsletter, which I read religiously.
Thank you.
And so thank you.
Appreciate it.